The story begins on a quiet evening in a small European town resting between the green hills and an endless river. The sun was melting into gold, and the streets were still wet from a soft rain. Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock had arrived that morning to film a charity documentary about rebuilding schools after a flood. The town was calm but broken, its walls still holding marks of the storm that had passed months ago. Keanu walked through the narrow streets with his usual quiet smile, stopping often to greet people and thank them for letting them film. Sandra followed beside him, holding a camera capturing children playing near a damaged bridge. Both were there not as stars, but as two people trying to understand how kindness could rebuild what water had destroyed. As they reached the edge of the old marketplace, a sound stopped them. It was a soft humming like a tune carried by the wind. They turned toward the ruins of the library and saw a small figure sitting on the steps. A boy, no older than 12, holding a small lump of clay in his hands. His eyes were closed, his head tilted slightly, but his fingers moved carefully, shaping the clay into a tiny bird. Keanu slowed his steps. Sandra lowered her camera. They both felt something unusual in that moment, a calmness that pulled them closer. The boy smiled before they even spoke. He said softly, "You don't have to step so carefully. I can hear your kindness." Sandra knelt beside him and asked gently, "What's your name?" "Luca," the boy said, still smiling. "I make birds for people who forget to look at the sky." Keanu looked at the small clay figure resting beside him. It was simple but full of detail, like it had been made by someone who could see far more than others. Then he noticed something else. The boy's eyes never moved. They stayed fixed toward the empty air. "You're blind," Keanu whispered, not as a question, but as a quiet realization. Luca nodded. "Yes, but I still see things. Maybe not the way you do." He lifted one of the clay birds and held it toward them. "You can have this one if you promise to keep it safe." Sandra took it carefully. "How much?" she asked. Luca shook his head. "No money. I only ask that you promise to visit the hill when the lights return." Keanu frowned gently. "What lights?" The boy smiled again. "You'll know when it's time." Before they could ask more, a gust of wind rushed through the square. Sandra turned for a second, shielding her camera from the dust. When she looked back, Luca was gone. Only the clay bird remained on the step. They waited, thinking he might return, but the marketplace was empty. The sound of his humming had faded into the wind. That night, back at their small guest house, Sandra placed the clay bird on the table beside her bed. She stared at it for a long time. There was something peaceful about it, yet something sad, too. "Maybe he lives nearby?" she said, breaking the silence. Keanu nodded. "Maybe, but there's something about him. Something different." He paused. "He said he could hear kindness." Sandra smiled faintly. "Maybe he can." As the lights dimmed, Keanu glanced again at the clay bird. For a moment, he thought he saw it shimmer faintly under the lamp, as if reflecting a distant light that wasn't really there. The next morning, they returned to the market asking people if they knew a blind boy named Luca. The locals looked puzzled. "A blind boy?" one old woman repeated. "We had one years ago. Poor child lost his sight when lightning struck the old library. But he left town long ago, or maybe he didn't." Keanu frowned. "What do you mean?" The woman leaned closer. "Some say his spirit helps rebuild what the storm broke. They say if you hear a humming near the ruins, it means hope is near." Sandra and Keanu exchanged glances. It couldn't be true, but something inside them refused to dismiss it. They went back to the library steps where they first met Luca. The wind was calm now, the air warm and silent. Keanu bent down and found a small clay feather lying near the cracks. He picked it up and showed it to Sandra. "He was here," Keanu said softly. Sandra nodded. Maybe he's still helping people in his own way. As they stood there, a group of children passed by, carrying buckets of paint and brushes. They were volunteers helping restore the town. One of them pointed toward the distant hill outside the village. "That's where we're rebuilding the art studio," she said proudly. "It's called the Hill of Hope." The name struck Keanu like a whisper of fate. Sandra felt it too. They both decided to visit that hill the next day, not knowing it would change everything. Not just for them, but for millions who would later watch the story unfold. That night, Keanu sat alone under the dim light, holding the small clay bird in his hands. He thought about the boy's voice. There was something haunting in those words. I build what I cannot see, because maybe someone else will. Those words echoed in his mind long after he fell asleep. The following day, Keanu and Sandra made their way toward the hill. It was a long path, lined with broken trees and half-fallen signs, but the view grew brighter as they climbed higher. Children were painting, laughing, and planting flowers. They were rebuilding the art studio that had been destroyed in the flood. One of the children told Sandra, "We're building this for kids who can't see but still want to create. The design was sent to us by someone named Luca." Keanu froze. "Did you say Luca?" The child nodded. "Yes, Luca sent the sketches weeks ago. No one's met him, but he sends letters written in Braille." Sandra looked at Keanu, her eyes wide with emotion. "He's real. He's alive." Keanu smiled faintly, though confusion lingered in his eyes. "And he's still helping, even from the shadows." They spent the rest of the day helping the volunteers. Keanu carried wooden boards while Sandra painted the outer walls with gentle pastel colors. The children's laughter filled the air, mixing with the wind's soft hum, the same tune they had heard from Luca. As the sun began to set, a light rain started again. A rainbow formed above the hill, glowing faintly against the clouds. It was then that Keanu noticed something. Dozens of clay birds hanging from the trees, each painted in different colors, fluttering softly in the breeze. One bird, however, was different. It was unpainted, resting alone on a branch facing the town. Carved underneath were the words, "For the friend who once walked in the dark." Keanu felt his chest tighten. There was something about that phrase, something he had seen before, but he couldn't remember where. Sandra placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What is it?" Keanu whispered. "It feels like something from my past." And somewhere deep in his heart, he knew that this story had only just begun. The next morning, the sky was washed clean. Sunlight spilled over the small town, lighting the rooftops still scarred by rain and wind. Keanu woke early, the image of the clay bird still fresh in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about the phrase carved beneath it. For the friend who once walked in the dark. It stirred something deep inside him, something that felt familiar but forgotten. He had written those exact words years ago, in a small notebook during a time of loneliness and reflection. It was the title of a short story he had donated anonymously for a charity auction to support children's hospitals. He had never known where the donation went, and he hadn't thought about it in years. But now, seeing those words on the hill carved into clay by a blind boy he'd just met, it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like destiny returning quietly. Sandra joined him outside carrying 2 cups of tea. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" she said softly. Keanu shook his head. "No, I kept hearing his voice. That boy, Luca. It's like he knew something about me." Sandra sat beside him. "You think the carving on the bird means something?" "I'm sure it does," Keanu replied. "But I don't know how yet." The two decided to visit the hill again, this time not just to help but to find answers. As they walked, they noticed something strange. Small clay feathers scattered along the path leading upward. Each feather seemed freshly placed, as though guiding them somewhere. The wind picked up gently, carrying that same faint tune they had heard before. It was a sound between humming and whistling, soft but filled with warmth. When they reached the top of the hill, the volunteers were already busy. Children painted clay birds, teachers arranged tables, and workers repaired the damaged walls. One of the coordinators greeted them with a smile. "Thank you for coming again," she said. "We've been trying to finish the main classroom before the weekend. It's going to be for blind and disabled children who lost access to their art lessons after the storm." Sandra smiled warmly. "It's beautiful what you're doing here. Did Luca design this whole plan?" The woman nodded. "He did. He sent blueprints made from raised paper drawings so we could feel the layout through touch. None of us ever met him in person, but his letters, they're full of hope. He said the hills should be a place where children learn to see through hands and hearts. Keanu listened quietly. The more he heard, the more his curiosity grew. "Do you still have his letters?" he asked. The coordinator nodded. "Yes, they're in the office. Would you like to see them?" Keanu hesitated. Part of him feared what he might find, but his heart told him he needed to know. "Yes," he said finally. "Please." Inside a small wooden office, sunlight streamed through the cracked window. The woman handed them a box tied with a ribbon. Inside were several envelopes written in Braille, each signed with a simple name, Luca. Sandra ran her fingers across one of the papers. "These are incredible. He must write them himself." Keanu carefully unfolded one of the letters and noticed that underneath the Braille were faint pencil markings. Someone had written translations beside the dots. The letter read, "Dear Builders of Hope, thank you for fixing the walls I can only dream of. I wish I could be there to help, but I am still learning how to see again. My mother says kindness is the color of light, and one day when I see the hill again, I will know what color hope truly is." Keanu's throat tightened. He read the next line aloud. "Please tell the friend who once walked in the dark that his story helped me believe I could see again." He froze. Sandra looked at him puzzled. "What does that mean?" Keanu took a deep breath. "That's what I used to call myself in that story. The friend who once walked in the dark. I wrote it after my own difficult time, to remind people that even in pain there's light waiting to return." Sandra's eyes widened. "You're saying Luca's surgery might have been paid for by that story?" Keanu nodded slowly. "It's possible. The charity that sold it used the funds for medical treatment for children who lost their sight in accidents." They both fell silent, realizing the connection. The boy they met, the one who had given them a clay bird, was living proof that a small act of kindness from years ago had come full circle. Later that afternoon, they stayed to help at the site. Sandra painted murals with the children while Keanu repaired a wooden bench near the entrance. He noticed a little girl struggling to shape a clay flower, her hands trembling. Kneeling beside her, he said softly, "It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to come from your heart." The girl smiled shyly. "Luca says that too." Keanu smiled back. "Then he must be a very wise boy. He's the best," she said proudly. "He told us to always build things we love, even if we can't see them yet." As evening approached, the workers began to leave. Keanu and Sandra stayed a little longer, sitting on the edge of the hill watching the orange sunset melt over the town. The clay birds hanging from the trees seemed to glow under the fading light, swaying gently as the breeze passed through. "You know," Sandra said quietly, "this whole place feels like it's alive. Like kindness left footprints here." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, maybe kindness never disappears. It just waits for someone to notice it again." The wind carried a soft humming, the same tune as before. Keanu turned his head. "Did you hear that?" Sandra nodded. "It's him." They stood and followed the sound down the slope toward the side of the hill where the forest began. The humming grew louder, clearer, and there by a small stream stood Luca, holding a clay bird, his eyes still closed. His face turned toward the light. He smiled as they approached, as if he had been expecting them. "You came?" Luca said softly. Keanu knelt in front of him. "We promised, didn't we?" Luca nodded and extended the clay bird. "This one's for you." "It's the last one I'll make here." Sandra frowned gently. "Why the last?" Luca smiled again. "Because tomorrow I leave for the city. My eyes are almost ready to see the world again." Keanu felt a lump in his throat. "Who helped you, Luca?" The boy tilted his head. "Someone I've never met. But I know he once walked in the dark." Keanu's breath caught. The wind rustled through the trees as if whispering the truth he already knew, but wasn't ready to speak aloud. As Luca walked away, the soft light of sunset fell across his face, revealing faint scars near his eyes, proof of the surgery that changed his life. He stopped and turned back, his voice gentle. "When I can finally see again," Luca said, "the first thing I want to look at is the sky. I want to see the color of kindness." Keanu smiled sadly. "It's everywhere, Luca. You've already seen it, just not with your eyes." The boy nodded, smiling, then disappeared down the path toward the town. Keanu stood silently, the clay bird still in his hands. He looked at Sandra, his voice low. "The story I wrote," he said, "was about a man who gave away his light so others could see. I never thought it would become real." Sandra touched his arm gently. "It did, Keanu, and the world is going to see it again." She was right. Soon what happened on that quiet hill, the boy, the story, the kindness reborn, would travel across the world in a way no one expected. But for now, as night settled and the clay birds swayed above them, all that mattered was the quiet truth between them, that even in the darkest moments, kindness always finds its way home. The next morning, rain clouds gathered again above the Hill of Hope. Soft thunder rolled in the distance as Keanu and Sandra walked through the muddy path, carrying boxes of art supplies. They had promised Luca they would help finish the last room before he left for the city. But something felt strange. The air was heavy, the wind colder than before. When they reached the top, they saw volunteers packing early. One of the coordinators looked worried. "There was a small storm last night," she said. "Some of the clay birds fell from the trees. We'll have to fix them." Keanu knelt to pick one up. The bird was cracked through the middle, its wings broken cleanly. Sandra picked up another and noticed faint letters inside the wing. She read softly, "To those who build light from loss." The words made her shiver. She looked at Keanu. "He must have written these before leaving." Keanu nodded. "Maybe he wanted us to find them." They placed the broken birds gently on the table. Then, from the far corner of the field, a familiar humming sound rose. Faint, carried by the wind again. Keanu turned toward the forest. "That's him." They followed the sound down a narrow path behind the hill. The trail led them to an old chapel half covered in vines. Its wooden door hung crooked, but the melody came from inside. As they stepped in, the light filtered through colored glass, scattering soft patterns on the dusty floor. In the center sat Luca, surrounded by small children, teaching them how to mold clay birds. When he heard their footsteps, he smiled. "I thought you might come," Sandra smiled. "You didn't tell us you were teaching here." "It's my last day before leaving," Luca said. "I wanted to finish what I started." Keanu knelt beside him. "You've done more than finish, Luca. You've changed this place." The boy laughed quietly. "No, Mr. Keanu. I didn't change anything. People only needed to remember what kindness feels like." As he spoke, Sandra noticed his bandages were gone. Faint scars traced around his eyes, but his gaze seemed different, unfocused, yet searching for light. "You can see now, can't you?" she asked softly. Luca nodded. "A little. Not everything, but enough to see colors. Blue, yellow, and gold. That's all I ever wanted." His voice trembled slightly with joy. Keanu felt something tighten in his chest. "Who paid for your surgery?" he asked gently. The boy tilted his head. "I told you before, a friend who once walked in the dark. The doctors said his story helped raise the money. I think he must be someone who understands what it feels like to lose sight of hope." Keanu couldn't speak. He only smiled faintly, hiding the truth behind quiet eyes. Later that evening, a photographer from a small local paper arrived. He asked to take pictures for a story about the hill. Keanu and Sandra stayed out of the frame, not wanting to take attention from the children, but one picture stood out. Luca holding a clay bird under sunlight, smiling toward the sky. The image captured something pure, something that would soon move hearts around the world. After the photos, Luca gave Keanu a folded note. "Keep this safe," he said. "Open it only when the birds fly." Keanu smiled softly. "When will that be?" Luca laughed. "You'll know." The next day, Luca left quietly for the city. The Hill of Hope stood finished, glowing under the morning sun. Keanu and Sandra stayed behind to clean the last room. Sandra placed Luca's photo on the wall, whispering, "He's going to do great things." Keanu nodded. He already did. As they left the hill, a sudden gust of wind blew through, lifting the clay feathers they had repaired. Dozens of them rose into the sky, circling above like real birds. Sandra gasped. "The birds," she whispered. "They're flying." Keanu opened the note Luca had given him. Inside, In faint handwriting were the words, "Thank you for helping me see what kindness looks like." His eyes glistened. That evening, the photo of Luca and the hill appeared online, shared by a volunteer. Within hours, it spread across the world. People everywhere began donating to rebuild schools, hospitals, and art centers under the name the Hill of Hope Foundation. No one knew the full story yet, that the man behind it all had once written a forgotten tale of light in darkness. But soon, the world would learn the truth. 2 weeks passed. The Hill of Hope had become a symbol across the world. Newspapers called it a miracle of compassion, and donations poured in from everywhere. Still, Keanu and Sandra kept quiet about their visit, letting the story belong to Luca and the children. But one morning, Sandra entered the cafe where they often met the local volunteers. She held her phone, her eyes wide. "Keanu, look at this," she said, sliding it across the table. On the screen was a video. Luca standing on a hospital stage, speaking softly to a small crowd. The caption read, "The blind boy who helped the world see kindness." His voice filled the room. "When I was blind, I thought darkness meant emptiness. But I learned darkness is only where light begins to grow. Someone once wrote a story that helped me believe in that." He held up a small, worn page. The story was called "A Friend Who Once Walked in the Dark." I don't know who wrote it, but his words gave me sight long before my eyes could. The audience applauded gently. Luca smiled and added, "If he's watching, I just want to say thank you." Sandra turned to Keanu. He looked down silent. His fingers trembled slightly as he stared at the screen. "It's your story," she said quietly. Keanu nodded slowly. "I never thought anyone even read it." "You didn't just write it," Sandra whispered. "You gave it away." That story paid for his surgery. Keanu took a deep breath. "I didn't do it for recognition. I just wanted to help, but to see how far it went." He stopped, emotion catching his voice. "It's bigger than me now." A few days later, Luca's video reached millions. Celebrities shared it, schools played it, and teachers told their students about the Hill of Hope. One evening, the town mayor invited Keanu and Sandra to attend an upcoming event, a special celebration at the rebuilt art studio. He said Luca would return to thank everyone who helped him. Sandra smiled. "We have to go." Keanu hesitated. "If he finds out it was me, then he'll finally meet the friend he's been thanking all along," she said gently. Keanu sighed, but a small smile grew on his face. "All right, let's go back to the hill." The day of the ceremony arrived under bright sunlight. The air smelled of fresh paint and flowers. Children lined the pathway holding clay birds, their laughter echoing in the breeze. Banners read, "Welcome home, Luca." When Luca stepped out of the car, the crowd cheered. He wore dark glasses but walked without hesitation, guided by his mother. His steps were steady, his smile calm. He stopped in front of the new studio where Keanu and Sandra stood quietly in the back row. The boy bowed his head in gratitude before the crowd. "This place," Luca began, "was built by hands that believed in something more than walls. It was built by hearts that saw kindness as the strongest color of all." Then he turned slightly toward the crowd. "And somewhere among you, there is the person who gave me that color, the one who once walked in the dark." His words echoed across the silent field. Keanu's chest tightened. Sandra touched his arm gently, whispering, "This is your moment." Keanu shook his head. "This is his story, not mine." But Luca continued, "Whoever you are, I want you to know, you didn't just help me see. You helped the world remember what kindness looks like." Tears filled many eyes in the crowd. The mayor stepped forward, thanking donors and volunteers. Keanu stayed silent, letting the applause belong to Luca. After the ceremony, as the sun dipped lower, Luca approached where Keanu and Sandra stood. He smiled softly. "You came back," Sandra nodded. "We wouldn't miss it." Luca held out a small package wrapped in cloth. "This is for you, Mr. Keanu. I made it when I was blind. I wanted to give it to someone who could see the way I do, with their heart." Keanu slowly opened the cloth. Inside was a small clay sculpture, 2 hands holding a tiny light between them. Carved underneath were the same words as before, "For the friend who once walked in the dark." Luca smiled faintly. I still don't know who he is, but I think he's closer than I realize. Keanu's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to tell the truth, but something held him back. Instead, he smiled softly and said, "He'd be proud of you, Luca." The boy nodded. "Then I'll keep the light alive for him." That night, as fireworks lit up the hill, Sandra and Keanu sat quietly near the studio steps. The clay birds hung again from the trees, glowing under the colored lights. "You know," Sandra said softly, "this story is spreading everywhere. But the best part isn't that people are watching, it's that they're feeling." Keanu smiled. "Maybe that's all stories should do. Remind people to feel again." He looked up at the sky where the birds swayed gently. "It started with one boy, one story, and one promise to see the light again. Now look at it." The world below the hill glowed with thousands of candles lit by the townspeople. Children were releasing clay feathers into the river, letting them float toward the horizon, and among the crowd, Luca stood with his mother, smiling toward the water. The next morning, mist covered the hill like a soft blanket. Keanu and Sandra stayed in town for one more day, helping volunteers clean up after the event. People were still talking about Luca's speech, calling it one of the most heartfelt moments they had ever witnessed. But deep inside, Keanu felt a quiet restlessness. The clay sculpture Luca gave him still sat in his hands. Every time he looked at the words carved below, "For the friend who once walked in the dark," something inside him trembled. As they packed their things, Sandra noticed his silence. "You're thinking about telling him, aren't you?" she asked. Keanu nodded slowly. "He deserves to know, but I don't want to take the light away from him." "This story isn't about me," Sandra smiled gently. "Maybe it's about both of you. Maybe the light was meant to be shared." He looked out the window, where children were hanging the last clay birds on the branches. "I'll tell him before we leave," he said quietly. That afternoon, Luca was sitting under a large oak tree near the school. He was helping a small girl paint her clay bird. The colors spread across her fingers, messy and bright. When Keanu approached, Luca smiled without turning his head. "I knew you'd come," he said softly. Keanu sat beside him. "You always seem to know." "You walk quietly," Luca replied. "But kindness always makes a sound," Keanu chuckled. "And what sound is that?" "Like a heartbeat," Luca said. Steady and gentle. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the breeze move through the trees. Finally, Keanu spoke. "Luca, do you remember the story that helped you when you were blind?" The boy nodded. "I think about it every day," Keanu's voice softened. "That story, it was mine. I wrote it years ago for a charity auction. I never knew who it reached until I met you." Luca turned toward him slowly, his eyes wide behind his dark glasses. You're the friend who once walked in the dark?" Keanu nodded, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't heal your eyes, Luca. I just wrote something from my heart. You're the one who turned it into light?" The boy stayed silent, his small hands shaking slightly. Then tears formed beneath his glasses. He reached out, touching Keanu's face carefully with his fingertips, tracing his expression like he was memorizing it. "I knew," Luca whispered. "I didn't want to say it, but I felt it. When you spoke, it was the same warmth I read between the words of your story." Keanu swallowed hard. "Why didn't you tell me?" Luca smiled faintly. "Because sometimes kindness works better when it doesn't wear a name." Keanu's eyes glistened. "You're wiser than most adults I know." "No," Luca said softly. "I just had the right story to guide me." As the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, Sandra joined them, holding her camera. She had quietly recorded their conversation, tears glimmering in her eyes. "You two just gave the world another story," she said softly. Luca turned toward her. "Then tell them not about me or him, but about what happens when people don't stop believing in kindness." She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I will." A few hours later, they all gathered by the river where the townspeople had built a small memorial. Hundreds of clay feathers floated gently downstream, glowing in the golden light. Each one carried a name, a hope, or a word of gratitude. The mayor approached Keanu and Sandra with a framed photo. Luca holding his clay bird, sunlight spilling behind him. "We're naming the new library after his story," the mayor said proudly. "It will be called the House of Light." Keanu smiled. "That's beautiful." As the crowd cheered, Luca walked closer to the riverbank. He held a new clay bird in his hands, this one painted gold. He turned to Keanu and Sandra. "This one's for both of you," he said softly. "You showed me what kindness looks like. Now I want the world to see it too." He placed the golden bird on the water. It floated for a moment, then drifted away, reflecting the sunlight like a living flame. The crowd watched in silence. Someone began to record. Within minutes, that image, Luca's golden bird gliding across the river, would spread across the internet, touching millions once again. Later that night, Sandra uploaded the short clip with the caption, "When light returns, it never comes alone." Within hours, it went viral. News outlets shared it with headlines like, "The Blind Boy and the Quiet Friend Who Changed the World." Thousands of people commented, writing how the story inspired them to help others to give without expecting anything back. Keanu read the comments quietly. One of them said, "The real sight is kindness. The rest is just light." He smiled. "They understand," he said softly. Sandra looked at him. "You finally told the world your part of the story without even saying a word." Days turned into weeks, yet the story of Luca and the Hill of Hope continued to spread like a wave of warmth across the world. Schools, artists, and volunteers started their own hope projects in many countries. Every post carried the same symbol, a small golden clay bird. Keanu and Sandra quietly returned to their normal lives, but something inside both of them had changed forever. Fame and film sets no longer felt like the center of their purpose. What mattered now were the unseen moments that healed others. One morning, Sandra walked into Keanu's trailer with a bright smile. "You should see this," she said, handing him a tablet. It showed a news headline. "The Hill of Hope Foundation builds its first school for blind children in India." Keanu's eyes softened. "That's Luca's idea, isn't it?" She nodded. "He's traveling the world now. Every time a new center opens, he sends a golden clay bird to bless it." Keanu smiled almost tearfully. "He's teaching others to see in ways we never could." That night, Keanu sat alone on his balcony, the same clay sculpture Luca had given him resting nearby. He thought about all the strange moments that led here. A forgotten story he wrote years ago, a blind boy selling clay birds, and how one act of kindness had returned as a miracle. He whispered quietly to himself. "You gave me back my own sight, Luca." His phone buzzed. It was a video message from Luca. The boy's voice, a little older now, filled the quiet air. "Mr. Keanu, I wanted to send you this. The Hill of Hope is now open in 3 countries. We teach blind children how to sculpt their dreams. We tell them about a man who once walked in the dark and decided to leave light behind for others. I hope you're proud of what your story started." The message ended with Luca holding a small golden bird. He smiled and said softly, "Remember, light doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to everyone who chooses kindness." Keanu closed his eyes. Tears rolled down silently, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming peace that comes when life comes full circle. A few days later, he and Sandra were invited to speak at a global humanitarian summit. The hall was filled with leaders, teachers, and young dreamers. Sandra spoke first about compassion and creativity, while Keanu stood quietly beside her, holding the clay sculpture. When it was his turn, he stepped forward and said, "Years ago, I wrote a small story about darkness and light. I never imagined it would find its way to a boy who would turn it into something far greater. What I've learned is that kindness doesn't end where you give it. It keeps walking, keeps growing until it lights someone else's path." The hall fell silent for a moment, and then applause rose like thunder. In that crowd, a young volunteer raised a small golden bird in the air. Soon, hundreds followed, holding the same symbol high above their heads. Sandra looked at Keanu, her eyes shining. "The world's listening," she whispered. Keanu nodded. "No," he said softly, smiling. "The world's feeling." Months later, Keanu and Sandra visited the Hill of Hope one final time. The children greeted them with laughter and songs. Luca, now taller and full of confidence, ran to meet them. His eyes sparkled. still faintly scarred, but filled with color and life. "You came back," Luca said, hugging them both. "We promised we would," Sandra replied. Keanu looked around at the rebuilt classrooms, the trees filled with clay birds and the sunlight washing over everything. "You've done something amazing, Luca," the boy smiled. "No, we did. I built what I couldn't see, and you helped me see what I built." They stood together on the hilltop, watching the horizon. The sun began to set, painting the sky with soft gold and orange. Luca reached into his pocket and pulled out a final golden clay bird. "This is for you," he said to Keanu, "for the story that started everything." Keanu smiled and placed the bird gently in the boy's hand. "No, Luca, it's for the world. Let's both set it free." Together they walked to the edge of the hill. The crowd below grew quiet as Luca lifted the bird into the wind. It floated higher and higher until it disappeared into the glowing sky. In that moment, no one spoke. They only felt. Sandra wiped her eyes and whispered, "The boy who couldn't see taught the world how to truly look." Keanu looked at her and said softly, "And the light that found him will never fade." As the golden bird vanished into the sunset, the hill of hope glowed brighter than ever, reminding the world that even the smallest act of kindness can become a light that never fades.